We talk about Bethesda a lot on this channel, on all my channels, frankly, because I'm an old school fan. I love Bethesda games, or some of the older ones. And I want them to be better. I want them to make better games and make improvements and stuff. And so inevitably we talk about Starfield, Fallout, Elder Scrolls a lot, Todd in general. And you know, that sometimes is very constructive. Sometimes we meme a lot and it can frustrate people, but I try at least to provide my perspective and constructive, actionable perspectives, ideas, whatever. But inevitably we end up with some Bethesda fans that get upset, that do not like the criticisms because they may take it personal, or maybe they honestly do feel that the criticisms or critiques are being made in bad faith, or being made without an honest care for the results. I got a comment on one of our recent clips where the individual used some aggressive language, so I'm not going to show the comment word for word because of TOS. They were passionate. I'll tell you that. They were passionate. But the comment that person made was effectively, and I'm of course paraphrasing here, it was effectively that, Luke, when you're looking at these videos of people explaining how they're dissatisfied with Starfield, or they're frustrated about Elder Scrolls or the direction of BGS, you're not looking at a true Bethesda fan. You're not looking at somebody's video who is a true fan. They basically said you're reacting to videos from like grifters who don't actually care about Bethesda or Elder Scrolls. They're just in it for the Bethesda rage bait. Okay. Interesting. I wouldn't cast aspersions like that. I wouldn't say that the people we've reacted to are acting in bad faith. But okay, even if we take it for granted and we say, okay, sure, let's run with that. It doesn't really dismiss any of the claims or critiques, but I thought, you know what? Let's find a video discussing Elder Scrolls 6 from one of the most hardcore and knowledgeable Elder Scrolls fans that I could find. And I found someone who really knows their stuff, has thousands of hours in old school Elder Scrolls content, and knows these games better than pretty much anybody I've ever seen. Like, really knows them backwards and forwards. It's a smaller channel by the name of Zerich Zark. And he's got the suit and tie, he's ready to go, and he has like an encyclopedic knowledge of how these games are built and work. Really knows his stuff. So I want to see what he thinks of Elder Scrolls 6, hear his thoughts, because I don't want anybody to think that we're just trying to filter out videos or reacted content based on like agreement or whatever, or based on shared experience. But I think even as you look at this video and as we watch it together, I have a sneaking suspicion that some of the common threads and critiques that I've raised and many other people have raised after Fallout 4, Fallout 76, Skyrim, or Starfield, and Skyrim to a certain extent, I think those critiques will carry through, because this is not just a grifter perspective. It's a broader perspective across many different subsets of the fandom, and even among some of the most hardcore fans that really know their stuff. And so I'm excited to hear what this guy has to say, because from the snippets and tidbits of other videos on the channel I've seen, really knows Elder Scrolls. So let's see here.
I like the Elder Scrolls series a lot. I have thousands of hours in Daggerfall, Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, and the Elder Scrolls Online. I like each of them for different reasons, although not necessarily the reasons people typically think I do. I love the format of the Elder Scrolls series. First person, real-time dungeon crawlers. There are tons of dungeon crawlers I could shout out, from Wizardry to Atarian Odyssey to Legend of Grimrock, but
those are deep cuts. If you're like, what? Exactly. Okay. Exactly. You can say whatever you want. You're listening to someone who knows these types of games. Okay, he knows these games.
None of them have that special something that the Elder Scrolls series does. Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall is a fantasy life sandbox with a political simulation ensuring that the world doesn't revolve around the player, but rather the player is adrift and subject to forces larger than them. Mods transform the experience further into a fantasy life simulation where it really does feel like you're living the life of a professional adventurer. Morrowind sacrifices the scope, scale, and unpredictability of Daggerfall, but in exchange has unparalleled world building, not to be confused with world design, which is the virtue the later Elder Scrolls games have. Rather, Morrowind's world building is an element of excellent background storytelling, and its main quest informs so much of the political landscape of Vardenfell. With expertly crafted mods like Tamriel Rebuilt and Project Tamriel that take Morrowind's game design ethos and quadruple the amount of thoughtfully crafted content, the only game that I feel does the world building, factions informing the political landscape better would be Fallout New Vegas.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Fallout New Vegas. I do think one of the things that's going to be broken up over the course of this is the slow transition and shift in philosophy that happened over the course of the series. Arena plays nothing really like a Daggerfall, or certainly once we get all the way up to like Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim. They start to play very, very differently, and the priorities shift and the direction starts to shift. And again, this is somebody that really knows their stuff, and you'll hear that brought up repeatedly, is that the focus on world building, on careful consideration and writing of the political landscape and everything, that starts to slowly be abandoned. And if you've ever tried playing like just a straight vanilla playthrough of Skyrim, you'll start to see this. You'll start to see it all over the place, where everything is quite low stakes. Major conflicts can be resolved in a 5-minute sequence. You want to become the head of the School of Magic, go do 10 minutes of questing, and boom, you're the head of the entire school. Like, you know, everything just like the stakes are lowered. Nothing is like that intense. And so it allows you to live this kind of fantasy, sort of power fantasy, where everything is super condensed into short time frames, but it also makes the world feel much more like your playground as opposed to like a world in which you happen to be exploring that is going to carry on whether you're in it or not. Yeah. Do you think he does reviews of the day? The Elder Scrolls review.
But that's a story for another day. Moving along, Oblivion sacrifices much of the world building that made Morrowind one of the best games in the world, and instead focuses on cinematic storytelling and world design. Oblivion contains the formative elements that basically all Bethesda games will be known for moving forward. Fallout 3, New Vegas, Skyrim, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76 are all more or less the exact same format as Oblivion. They are open-world sandbox dungeon crawlers that do first-person real-time exploration and combat. When people say that one of these newer games has better story than Daggerfall or Morrowind, they're usually referring to the expression of the story, how it's conveyed to the player. The overall writing doesn't get better per se, but rather the world building in later games begin to use earlier games as a crutch, but paradoxically change whatever they feel like.
I do think that this is an important distinction though, because when we talk about like a game's story or narrative, a lot of the time people will break it down and they think literally like it's the outline of this character does this, and this character goes there, and this character does this, and this character does that, and then this happens. But that's not really all that there is. You know, in the world of, well, I mean, even if we just stick to Skyrim, like Skyrim is not, its story is not just, hey, you have these weird magic dragon abilities. Okay, you're gonna go and you're gonna fight this big dragon and free the land from that. It's not just that. It's informed by all of the factions. It's informed by the political landscape within the world itself, the map, and then that's influenced by everything else. In The Witcher 3, it's not just go here, find Yennefer, find the weird mutant baby, and then go and do this, and then this happens, and then you find Ciri, and then this happens, and then you fight the Wild Hunt, and the story's over. It's so much more than that. It's exploring Oxenford, it's exploring Novigrad and going to Skellige, and it's seeing how those different peoples interact with each other. The side quests inform it, the characters you meet on tangential quests that also tie back into the main story. All of that is part of the story, you know? It's not just the broad strokes of the main quest. And I think that sometimes it can be boiled down too much into that way, where it's like, well, honestly, I thought that the story was quite boring in this game because it was a very simple quest. when that's not necessarily the key. AC Shadows, for example, it basically has the exact same premise as Ghost of Yote. I think Ghost of Yote has much better story overall, narrative overall, because it's all of the other stuff that also contributes to the main story and the main quest that builds it up. Whereas AC Shadows, everything is like pretty plain and monotone and dry and largely, in my opinion, uninteresting by comparison. So I do think that this is a crucial comparison to bring up, or distinction to bring up that he's mentioned. And so I absolutely agree with that. And I think it's important to remember that just because you may love the universe of like a Fallout, that does not mean that the writing in Fallout 76's narrative content is good, because as Zark said, the previous games start to get used as a crutch, where the foundations that they laid are now being used to keep people engaged, whereas like the individual writing nowadays may not be that interesting or compelling, but they're relying on your nostalgia, your love for the franchise, your knowledge of the lore and other stuff like that to keep you hooked. And it's why I think in large part Starfield started to fall really flat. And it's because they had no nostalgia or foundation to rely on. They didn't have stuff done by really talented writers 20 years before to rely on. It was all just Emil's work, which lots of people found lacking. So again, very important distinction.
I'm not saying a series of creative works can't change ideas as it evolves. We wouldn't want lore to be reduced to a shackle limiting creativity. But when the changes are done in the interest of making the overall world less fantastical and containing less interesting things because of limitations within the current design iteration, that's when I have a tendency to complain about it. And complain about it I have over the years. For example, people harp on Cyrodiil not being a jungle as kind of a catch-all for their criticism with how Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion didn't match up to their expectations. But I don't really care about that one specific thing too much. What bothers me is the loss of the Imperial forts and the Imperial Navy, both references from Morrowind, the Imperial Dragon Riders from Elder Scrolls Legend Battlespire, the airships from Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard and Morrowind, and finally, a substantive difference between Calovia and Nibene as cultures, something that Oblivion's own lore books and own NPCs insist is a thing, but is not expressed in the reality of gameplay. There's a width and breadth.
I love the specificity, dude. I love it. It's just, it's very nice to hear like deep cuts, stuff from like, what airships? And it's like, oh yeah, oh, it all starts to come back in, and it's just, again, it's very nice to hear. Again, you could say whatever you want. Knows his stuff, right? Like, come on.
To the writing of Tamriel that isn't expressed in Elder Scrolls 4, and that's fine, I guess. It's not a good thing, but when I sit down and play Oblivion, I have fun. So circling back around to break this down, backstory, lore, world building, characters, narrative, all of these are elements of a story. But when the average player, not to be confused with a YouTube talking head, when the average player talks about story, they are discussing the emotional journey the book, movie, or game took them on. In order to be taken on an emotional journey, one has to enjoy the experience of partaking in the medium. That's why book talkers are some of the most miserable human beings on the face of the earth.
Book Talk is a sub-community on the internet social media platform TikTok that focuses on books and literature. This book club emerged in late 2019 as TikTok was becoming more popular. Members of the sub-community, also known as Book Talkers, make videos reviewing, discussing, and joking about the books they read. These books range in genre, but many content creators tend to focus on young adult stuff. Sorry, this is funny.
That's because most of them hate reading. Therefore, they can never partake in the journey. Likewise, people
most of them hate reading.
Playing, the most recent example would be Starfield, just to critique it, most likely never took the time to enjoy the individual quest stories the companion NPCs had. And the players who were playing it just to critique it, most likely saw those NPCs as an impediment to their completion of that critique. If the core gameplay loop isn't enjoyable, people aren't going back to stick around and enjoy the story. A game can have the best story in the world, but if the gameplay isn't fun, it fails as a game, at least for most people. That's partly why I take offense.
I think that's true, and I think with these types of games, like I've used the terms like this game is really easy to play. And when I use that term, I often clarify, I'm not saying the difficulty is easy. Usually what I mean is that it's easy to just play for hours, easy to get lost in. Like, you know, those types of games where you just start it and you just kind of lose yourself. And you look up, you check your watch, and oh God, 3 hours has gone by. You know, you lose yourself in it. It's one of my favorite things about old school Bethesda games is that I was able to get lost in those games very easily and very frequently. It's something I loved about New Vegas, and I still get lost in New Vegas all of the time. Expedition 33, KCD 2, for me, I agree, David, very easy to play, where you just get lost in it. And when you get lost, it sort of does this weird thing where it disarms your critical faculties in a good way, where you stop like critiquing things actively in your mind and you just are present. You're purely present, you know? And that's when you will have the most impactful, like, emotional experience with a story, whether it's a film, a novel, a TV show, or a game. It's when you can have the most fun. It's like, I still remember times, or like a time when I was playing, for example, Red Dead 2, and sort of spoilers for something you find near a cave in the far, I think, northeastern area of the map, if I recall correctly. But I remember I was just riding as I think Arthur, and I heard something as I rounded a corner up along this like cliffside, and I like kind of turned around and I walked back over there, and basically you hear what now is commonly referred to as like the Bigfoot Easter egg in Red Dead 2.
Next to the Indian reservation, a flock of birds will appear in the sky. If you follow them, they will take you to Bigfoot's cave.
Yeah, with the weird ledge.
Hi.
What's your name?
John. John Marston, usually. Who are you?
Have you found Bigfoot?
And there's like a whole conversation in there. It's like a giant, not Bigfoot. Yeah, it's like commonly called the Bigfoot Easter egg, but it's like you never see him, I don't think. But like I was just lost in the world, just exploring, having a good time. And I came across that, and years later, it still has stuck with me. It was a really, really cool moment. That was just emergent because I got lost in it, you know? I eat it up. I love that kind of thing. And that's when you can really connect with a game's world in a way you're not going to if you're just blasting through the story. You know, it's connection with that world in a deeper way that happens when you're disarmed and when you are lost in it. That's when you really get immersed, and that's why immersion is so important in a game, I think. And one of the ways you get immersed is when the gameplay systems are fluid, are fun, are engaging, and reinforce exploration and immersion in that world. You know, if you could have a really well put together open world map, an interesting story, but if, for example, traversal is super annoying and breaks you out of immersion constantly, like in Starfield with the fast travel stuff and load screens, you're constantly going to be ripped out of immersion, and you're not ever going to really get lost in that universe, in that world. And you know, you can say, well, Luke, in older games, load screens were much more common. Yeah. The standards have changed, and players now are conditioned to seamless exploration. And when players are conditioned for that, they expect it. And when it doesn't do that, it's jarring. Ooh, I dropped some frames there. That was weird. I dared to start mentioning load screens, and Todd sent us a sonic beam to my computer. That was weird. But anyway, that I think is a major component of this that I totally agree on. You have to be able to get immersed and lost in the world to appreciate all of those side stories, side quests. Otherwise, you'll never engage with them, never really appreciate them, and you won't connect with it in that same way. It's why immersion's important. And gameplay is important even in a narrative heavy game. You still have to have a certain level of gameplay fluidity and immersion that contributes to it.
But if the gameplay isn't fun, it fails as a game, at least for most people. That's partly why I take offense to calling visual novels games, even if they sometimes have game elements inside of them, because they're made primarily to be read. Even if some real work has to be done to reach the true ending, your expectations sitting down to the experience is completely different from your average video game. Speaking of completely different expectations, I believe firmly that the video game pathologic is art. But it also has a different goal other than fun. It makes the player feel confusion, pressure, even desperation. I believe it succeeds in that, but I also have to be careful who I recommend it to, because not all media is in fact comfort media. So the modern Bethesda game...
1000% agree. 1000% agree. It's the comparison I brought up previously was like, for example, like Schindler's List as a film. Phenomenal film. It is not fun. I struggle to even say if it's entertaining. Like, you know, it's something else. It's maybe important, something like that. You could say that, but it's not fun, certainly. But that doesn't mean it's not worth watching or engaging with. And in the same vein, there's video games that I think are very good or compelling. I don't know if I'd call them fun. Like even The Last of Us Part 2, would I call that game fun? Like there's not a lot of joy that goes through your brain when you play something like The Last of Us Part 2. That doesn't mean it's not worth playing. You can appreciate it, and maybe it's engaging, or it's interesting or captivating. There's all sorts of words you could use for it, but fun is not the end all be all, certainly. I do think that that's an important distinction. Terra Rising, thank you for the 5, says, perfect example is the ships you meet wandering in Starfield. If we were floating instead of load screen into them, they would have felt more emergent, and it would disarm you. I do think that is accurate. Like, it's really hard to get lost in a world when you're constantly asked to pause, like, all sensory appreciation. So go. You're feeling immersed while exploring this world? Well, okay. Well, if you want to get back to your ship, you can walk back, but it's going to take you 10 minutes of silence, and nothing will happen because you already traversed over that area, so no new spawns will happen. So you can fast travel back. When you fast travel back, there's going to be a load screen, and then you're going to need to fast travel into the cockpit, and then you fast travel into orbit, and then you fast travel from orbit to the other planet you want to explore. And it's just like, it's really hard to get lost in that, you know? Some people can do it, they can tune it out, others can't. And I think that the disjointed reaction and reception is kind of proof positive of that.
Is a comfort media experience where the story is expressed to the player in real time through voice dialogue. If presentation is what you value most, Oblivion is certainly when Bethesda games achieved their current form. Oblivion tosses out most of the unique world building set up for it in both the pocket guides and the NPC dialogue from Morrowind in favor of its own thing, in a sort of medieval fantasy sandbox that doesn't really have a whole lot on its own as a setting. But at the time, it did stand out. A lot of its competitors in the fantasy RPG space were still isometric, or first-person grid-based at the time. The few 3D games were typically linear and not open world. When I say Oblivion tossed things out, though, I'm talking about the well-written subtext and political intrigue of Vardenfell. It became an overt good versus evil plot. NPCs rarely had hidden motivations, and when they did, it was short-lived. Basically everything in...
Well, and I think that this also is important to acknowledge that right around the time where Emil started getting really, really involved, or even becoming the main writer on things, you started to notice this like dumbing down of concepts and ideas. And I think what it honestly is a lack of respect for the player, or appreciation for the player's ability to appreciate the story. And it's reflected in that talk he gave where he said, you know, we could write the next great American novel and players will rip out the pages and make paper airplanes, implying that therefore you shouldn't even bother trying, you know? He's like, why bother trying to write the next great American novel if they're just going to rip pages out of it? I mean, you would hope that they would do it anyways because they want to write the best story that they can, and somebody will appreciate it. Even if just one player appreciates this complex motivation for the villain, it's worth it. But that's not what he's arguing or saying in that talk. In that talk, he's basically arguing that nobody's going to appreciate it, so you just shouldn't bother wasting the time on it. Go for quantity over the quality, because nobody will really care about the quality, which is just patently false. And it's why I think you started to see all of these things stripped out and things simplified down. So then the storyline basically just becomes bad guy doing bad things because bad guy mean. And it's like, there's not a whole lot more to it than that. It's just very, very simplistic and unidimensional, but that's the type of game that they started to make, like especially coming out of like the Fallout 3 era going into Skyrim and Fallout 4. Fallout 4, I think they started to experiment with it, but it was like really revealed that they did not have, I think, the writers to pull that off, because there's a lot of plot holes in Fallout 4 if you start really looking for them. That can cause like problems. A lot of stuff that just doesn't really make a lot of sense, you know. And it's even okay. I guess no spoilers, even though I really want to. Maybe we'll do a deep dive on Fallout 4's story. That could be funny, but no extensive spoilers. But even the basic premise of why your child is abducted in the start of Fallout 4 doesn't really make any sense when you start to think about it. It's a whole other thing. Anyway, continuing on.
Oblivion, minus a few standout examples, operates under entirely on what you see is what you get. The world became the centerpiece of everything you did. In exploring the world, you found countless things to occupy your mind as you ping-ponged from area to area, which isn't a bad thing if exploring is your favorite thing to do in a Bethesda game, and it is for me. Skyrim is a refinement of Oblivion in many respects. Fans of Morrowind and Oblivion will often tell you that Skyrim isn't really as much of an RPG as Oblivion is, and depending on what your criteria for what makes an RPG, they'd probably be right. RPG is an overused term these days, and if you tell a stranger something is an RPG and provide no other information, a meeting of the minds most likely did not occur because the two of you had different ideas on what the term RPG means. In this case, though, it's strictly mechanical. Skyrim drops the stat system that the Elder Scrolls series had going since its inception, and tied everything into a set of perks, which, while not horrible, was certainly lacking for someone who really really wanted a sense of mechanical complexity. Bethesda has a tendency to identify problems with their previous games and throw the baby out with the bathwater rather than fix them. But people define RPGs in other ways as well. For example, a lot of
I do think that that's true. I think that what Bethesda's general approach is that they look at it and they're like, okay, we had a game people loved back in the day with Morrowind that had endless depth, maybe not endless, extensive depth. And so they're like, we have plenty of meat to cut and trim if we need to. And so they've just been doing that for 2 decades. And now there's not a lot left on the bone, but they're like, oh, well, we could trim that out and make that even more streamlined. And so you end up just with this bizarre thing that it has very little in common with what you initially fell in love with. This dude is funny on his mods. Well, the mod that I first noticed was that this is the mod for like the alternative start, or it's one of the alternative start mods. So you don't start on the wagon, you start as like in the fort, and he definitely has the jiggle physics turned on. Pretty aggressive jiggle physics.
Inception, and tied everything into a set of perks, which, while not horrible, was certainly lacking for someone who really wanted a sense of mechanical complexity. Bethesda has a tendency to identify problems with their previous games and throw the baby out with the bathwater rather than fix them. But people define RPGs in other ways as well. For example, a lot of people who are fans of Bethesda games will insist that an RPG must allow you to create your own character, which isn't true of the majority of non-tabletop RPGs in existence. Oh, it's one of my favorite aspects of a Bethesda game, right below exploration. And don't get me wrong, it has its roots in tabletop RPGs, which I personally equate to being the most pure form of RPGs. But
agree, preach, tabletop RPGs. Oh, I love me a good tabletop RPG. I actually just wrote the like first session of the next campaign I want to do. I set it up as a one shot that's going to lead into it because I want to give people an off ramp if they decide, yeah, I don't want to commit to a year of this one game. But yeah, I agree. Tabletop RPGs are the purest form of it. But yeah, anyway, sorry, distracted.
Creating your own character is only one possible expression of what it means to be an RPG. Of course, you'll get the lazy person saying, if you play a role, it's an RPG. But I simply refuse to acknowledge that playing the role of Gordon Freeman.
I just simply refuse to acknowledge that perspective. I was ready for that. I'd respect it, honestly. Because that drives me crazy, dude. When people are like, well, really, in a lot of ways, Super Meat Boy is an RPG because you're playing the role of a Super Meat Boy, And it's like, shut up. I don't want to do business with you. Okay, what was he actually going to say?
Lazy person saying, if you play a role, it's an RPG. But I simply refuse to acknowledge that playing the role of Gordon Freeman makes Half-Life an RPG. Really, the Elder Scrolls series are action games with light RPG elements from the word go, compared to something like Baldur's Gate 2 or Fallout 1 and 2. Fallout 1 and 2 weren't made by Bethesda, by the way. And that's fine. Not every sandbox game needs to be a mechanically heavy RPG. Unlike previous Elder Scrolls games, which have been gradually escalating in levels of popularity, Skyrim was what we refer to as a cultural touchstone, and pierced the...
Real quick, before he gets into Skyrim, I do think that this is an important point, which is that Bethesda they haven't for like 20 years. They don't really make role-playing games. They make adventure games, and they're good at that. And they're good at building like worlds you want to explore. But they're not really RPGs. And I actually have a theory that maybe part of the reason why when Bethesda reveals something and the game finally comes out and people test it against what they were hoping for, they find it lacking. I think part of that is because people love Bethesda games as they remember them, but not always for what they are. Like, a lot of people think back to Fallout 3 or Skyrim, and they have very, very fond memories of the roleplay and exploration or anything, which were great in their time. But by modern standards, after we've gotten tastes of other RPGs that really executed on it very, very well, that sort of retroactively tainted our memory of that, and we look at it through rose-tinted glasses. We remember Fallout 3's story as being much more compelling than it was. We remember Skyrim's world being a lot bigger than it actually was, and there being a lot more maybe emotional weight to some of the things you found. But then when you replay it, you're like, oh, barring and setting aside nostalgia just for its own sake, it's not quite what I remembered. Like, I forgot that it only took me 10 minutes to become the head of the College of Winterhold. Like, I kind of spaced that, it just kind of made me space it. So I think that that's a component of it, which is just that people look back on these games with rose-tinted glasses, and then they find the new one lacking, even though it was never even probably that possible that we were going to get anything that deep. with the new game. And because I do think that there's this disconnect between what a huge component or a huge portion of the Bethesda Game Studios fan base wants and what they're actually capable of delivering, which they've alluded to a couple of times where like Emil says, we made the best game we knew how to make. And I think to a certain extent that's true. It's just not the game that the fans wanted. The
barrier of niche fandoms spilling into the general popular consciousness.
Yeah,
similar to how
huge.
World of Warcraft did for MMORPGs. MMORPGs having been a niche thing before World of Warcraft pierced that barrier and normal people started hearing about it. People who
that's huge. That's a huge thing to like keep in mind. Skyrim was the first of these like massive open world games that really pierced that broader cultural veil or barrier, whatever you want to call it. Similarly, like Red Dead 2 did it, where you remember Red Dead 2 launched and you saw like South Park episodes referencing it, where the like police chief in South Park is putting on his hat and his coat and he sits back down to start a new game. Because his wife was playing without him and ruined his save file. That's how you know that you've made it mainstream. And whenever that happens with a game, it pierces that cultural veil, becomes mainstream. You're going to start to see a ton of clones and duplicates. And I mean, we've seen it with Dark Souls stuff, where Dark Souls and Elden Ring, we've seen tons of Souls-like games come out. That's its own genre now. And what sometimes happens is that the one that was first was groundbreaking for its time, but it inevitably falls behind the later ones that take lessons and learn from it and improve upon the formula. Rarely do you get one where like the person who did it first, or the company that did it first rather, they continue to be the best at it. I would argue you typically see that with FromSoft stuff where they just are at the top of their game. Same with Rockstar. But in the case of Bethesda, I think that there's been other companies that have come and done the open world system and open world narrative adventure game much, much better.
had never heard of the series before. People who had never even played video games before started hearing about these titles through their friends, family, and coworkers. This is a level of cultural saturation that makes the focal point a touchstone that everyone can look back on and refer to. Being a cultural touchstone, it will forever be seen as an aspirational point, both from their users and to their corporate owners at Microsoft. While I quite enjoy Fallout 4, 76, and Starfield as dungeon crawlers, those games didn't catch on quite like Skyrim did. Many would refer to Skyrim as being lightning in a bottle, something that Bethesda has been unable to recapture since. Until recently, Bethesda has had no rival for Skyrim. Nobody was willing to put anything near into Bethesda's level of effort for building an open world sandbox. Even games adjacent to it, like Kingdoms of Amalur, for example, didn't really have the time to focus on their worlds nearly as much as Bethesda did. Even going into 4 and 76, their attention to detail in open worlds was unmatched. When rivals in the industry attempted to push the open world trend, they lacked the experience, and inevitably, empty and shallow reflections of what Bethesda was doing began to manifest. The open world trend became synonymous with boring content. That's because while Bethesda was only really doing good enough writing, good enough combat, good enough graphics, the open world design was the star of the show and fun to explore. Recently, however...
Yeah, isn't it kind of remarkable how in the age of Skyrim, open worlds were seen as like the cream of the crop? It's like you hear an open world and that was a selling point for a lot of people, because it was the idea of exploration, of endless possibilities, of finding all sorts of crazy stuff hidden behind corners and tucked underneath rugs. I don't know. And in just a matter of a few years, open world started to be something you'd kind of roll your eyes at. It became, as he said, synonymous with like low effort content, repetitive content, uninteresting content, which I would argue like Ubisoft was a major contributor to that. EA with like Dragon Age Inquisition certainly fell victim to it as well. But it's also a reflection of the time. There was the interview recently with the game director for Assassin's Creed 3, and it was fascinating because back at the time when Assassin's Creed 3 launched in like 2012, you have to remember where we were. We were at a point where secondhand game sales were becoming such a frustration for major console manufacturers and publishers that Xbox was pressured by publishers and then also their own internal metrics into getting rid of used game sales. So they announced the Xbox One and said there were going to be no secondhand copies of games. Or if there was going to be all sorts of hoops you have to jump through to transfer ownership from one user to another. Because they didn't want you to buy a game for $60 and then sell it to your friend for $5, or go to GameStop, sell it for $45, and then GameStop sells it for $50 to somebody else. And then the publisher didn't get any amount of money for the second copy. And so they tried to strong arm it. And that didn't end too well for them. But interestingly, what Ubisoft did to combat that and the secondhand market was that they found if they increased the length of their games significantly, they could end up with players keeping games for longer. And therefore, if the game reviewed well or people thought it was interesting or word of mouth was good, they would then go and just buy it new because there weren't enough used copies to actually get your hands on because people were still playing it. So the director of Assassin's Creed 3 said that at the time, their push was to make their games longer so that they would drive up playtime and therefore players would be less likely to sell it secondhand, so that any copies that would move would be new copies that the money would go to the publisher, which is kind of low-key brilliant. Makes sense. I verified this. I was talking with somebody who worked at Ubisoft at the time, actually, on the recent Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 trip. Used to work in Ubisoft Publishing at the time. And he verified. He's like, yep, that's why. The big push for open worlds being massive and huge, Ubisoft open worlds being massive and huge, that was to combat secondhand sales. Yep. I was like, oh, well, there you go. And I think that that was reflected with EA, with Dragon Age Inquisition, which won Game of the Year in 2014, which even furthered the desire to replicate that. A lot of studios were like, look to that for inspiration. They have 100 hours of content. And they started pumping that out. And so it's certainly a component of it. But it is fascinating to just consider that not that long before, open worlds were synonymous with like interesting, captivating immersion and adventure. And then in just a few years, that was literally flipped 180 degrees, and it was considered like boring, repetitive, bland, soulless content.
Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon has been fully released, and Ardenfall is approaching an early access release. Games like Elden Ring, despite being panned by some of the classic Souls fans, were well received by the masses as an open world game. In other words, good open world games are proven to be possible outside of the Bethesda space, but their success really hinges on them getting enough marketing, enough to compete with a Bethesda game. Yes, just making a good game isn't enough to be a smash hit these days. You have to either be insanely lucky to the point where the industry has no idea how to replicate it, or you brute force it with a huge marketing budget, which is what Microsoft does. Unfortunately, in a post-open world video game industry, Starfield has failed to garner the kind of attention and player base to make it anywhere resembling a cultural touchstone. The most prominent meme about the game isn't even from the game. It's a bald man screaming about pronouns. And
it is true. That is like the main meme I've seen from it, which unfortunately nowadays, this is the world we live in. Memes are usually a pretty good indication of what like broader culture's takeaway is from what you put out. Like, you remember when Helldivers 2 launched, everybody was memeing and joking about liberty, for the love of liberty, as his leg is getting blown off. There were memes about the game that were genuinely hilarious. They were using that sound of the guy, like two Helldivers talking to each other. What are you going to do after the war? After we spread democracy? He's like, I'm going to go back to my mama and I'm going to share my journeys with her. And then he gets shot by, a filthy wireback clanker. And he drops dead and you just hear the screams. And those types of memes went viral. And that's what people remember Helldivers for, if they're not still playing it, which a lot of people still are. Even like with Baldur's Gate 3, there were all sorts of memes about, sex with bears and some of those early stories that went viral about the game's writing and just the sheer variety of consequence and things that you could see. It was really, really interesting. But in the case of Starfield, like, what's the meme? What's the cultural impact? There's not a lot. Load screens. The meme is kind of now load screens constantly. Like, I guess not exactly what you'd want.
it's a shame because underneath a bad main quest and a lack of a good gameplay loop linking its systems, there are some pretty nice character writing moments and some delightful dungeon design. We know what Starfield lacks most, however, and that is the heart and soul that makes every other modern Bethesda game in the Oblivion post-era work, and that's a connected open world. Starfield has segmented open worlds, and not a whole lot stand out in each one of them. Now that Microsoft owns Bethesda and Starfield was unfortunately a cultural flop, Elder Scrolls 6 is perhaps the last chance the current team at Bethesda Game Studios in its current form.
I can't with the mods for the idle animations. Just these are the people you need to make happy. Developers, okay? You should cherish and treasure this, okay? Don't judge us. It's crazy. I do think it is interesting. I did see another comment from somebody on one of our Starfield videos where they were saying, actually, I think Starfield is the ultimate dungeon crawling game. And then all caps, let me explain before you downvote. And he made a compelling case, honestly. Basically, his argument was that dungeons, as defined in most games, are like small areas that may be procedurally generated or even hand built, but they're smaller areas for you to explore with individual encounters, treasures, points of interest, things like that to find. You go, you complete them, and you rarely need to return to them once you've already cleared them, if ever. And he argued that each individual loading zone on every single planet in Starfield constituted its own dungeon. So he was basically arguing that Starfield has basically endless dungeons, each unique and engaging and interesting because they all have different stuff to find. And I was like, like, I think technically you're right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. The problem is it's all just repeated content, and a lot of those dungeons are you just like running endlessly through a field of rocks trying to get to a POI only to realize it's the same one you've seen 15 times or it's empty, so I think you got me on a technicality, but it doesn't mean that the dungeon is good, because that's a separate question. But I was like, honestly, if you're literally just saying it has one of the most endless or one of the most open-ended dungeon crawling experiences in a modern game, I do think technically that's right. Probably. Yes, but actually no. Yeah, kind of like that, Sneaky Pickle, exactly. Yeah, but no.
As it creating something that will truly stand the test of time like Skyrim has. I successfully predicted Fallout 76 years before it came out because I understood ZeniMax Media at the time. I didn't believe the Oblivion remaster was real because it wasn't like ZeniMax Media to outsource anything Elder Scrolls to an external company. They would usually establish or acquire a studio and label it as a spin-off to Bethesda Game Studios and call it a day. Microsoft, however, is a different beast, and as the Oblivion remaster has proven, I cannot predict what they are going to do. The reason I'm relatively sure Elder Scrolls 6 is going to rely on paid modding is how Fallout 4, Skyrim, and Starfield are all utilizing the Microsoft Partner Center, being ham-fisted into its current single-player games.
But even that, you can't just pass it off totally to Microsoft because the leaked slides from like 2021, before the deal went through, well, I guess it was technically right about that time, but right about the time where all of this was happening, the acquisition, because I think the acquisition was right around that time. March of 21 is when it officially closed. Okay, Microsoft Gaming took it over. Okay, so it was technically March of 2021. In September they entered into the agreement to buy them, but it closed in March of 2021. But right around that time, we had slides that later leaked and came out as a result of the FTC hearings for Activision Blizzard. And some of those slides and stuff were indicating, unless I'm misremembering timelines, the intention to do the Fallout 3 remake and the Oblivion remaster remake. So I think a lot of this was in the works even before or very, very, very early on the Microsoft acquisition and acquiring of them. But again, timelines could be messy. So I could be wrong, could very much be wrong, because it could change. If like those slides were dated July of 2021, then that could just suggest that Microsoft came in and said, you're doing this. So I will just leave it there. I could be wrong.
I'm pretty sure this is going to happen with Elder Scrolls 6 as well. That said, I have it on good authority that paid mods, as they are displayed, unless this has been fixed, their numbers are greatly exaggerated. I'm told it's not counting first-time downloads only, but rather impressions. That is to say, every time an attempted download happens, incomplete or repeat. In other words, people deactivate, delete, then reactivate their mods, delete their entire mod lists, or reinstall the game and re-download everything. All of that will count as an extra download every single time. So the numbers of paid mod downloads are likely greatly inflated over the number of actual purchases. Still, some recurrent income for Microsoft is better than none in their eyes. So I'm confident paid mods will play a part in Elder Scrolls 6. After purchasing ZeniMax Media and acquiring Bethesda, I'm certain Microsoft was afraid of killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. From their perspective, I don't think Starfield was as much of a golden egg as they profess with their Game Pass subscriptions. Game Pass took a dip after the initial wave of Starfield players, despite the fact it was marketed by Todd Howard as something that was supposed to be played for years. I suspect to correct course there'll be directives from Microsoft this time around, and what's to follow is pure speculation since, as I mentioned before, I can't accurately predict what Microsoft is going to do next. So again, I think that they are going to discard a number of ideas from Starfield and focus on making the game as close to Skyrim as possible, set in a new...
This is where we get into the interesting bit. What what are their takeaways from Starfield and what will change based on like that for Elder Scrolls 6. I think paid mods will continue to be a massive focus. So I'm not sure if he's suggesting that they are going to step back from those a little bit because the numbers are inflated. I think that's a huge component of the monetization. So I think that that's just going to be doubled down on even further. I think if anything, they probably will have even more content ready to go because I think they weren't satisfied with the flow of content in the paid mods that came shortly after the game's launch. I think they want to like every week have a new quest available, a new weapon available that they're just cutting from the base game and selling back to you. But that's what they're going to do, I think. Beyond that, in terms of a broader, more general design philosophy, there's kind of two options as far as I can tell. Either they just make Skyrim 2, which I think is probably the most likely. The alternative is that they do Starfield, but with swords. And I maybe it's a melding of the two. Typically, though, what Bethesda has done for a very long time is that they just go and they start with like what they've built out. So they start with like this in 2006, and then with 2008 with Fallout 3 they add on a little bit more, and then in 2011 with Skyrim they have a little bit more that they've added on to it, and then we get Fallout 4 and they add in new like cinematic camera stuff, and they have voice protagonists, and some of it works, some of it doesn't. Base building, Fallout 76 they expand base building and add online multiplayer as a component. Doesn't start well, but it eventually catches its stride. With Starfield, they add on even more with procedurally generated content. And it basically has everything that the previous games had, except maybe the online content. Who knows if they change that eventually. But they add on more to it and build upon it. And then we get to Elder Scrolls 6. And what is it going to do? I personally don't think they're going to start cutting out components of like the procedural stuff. I don't think they're going to cut out like base building and some of these things that were added in previous games. I think all of that will still be there. I think they're going to have like build your own castle. I think like you're going to customize your own little castle fortress, just like in Fallout 4, and just like the ship building in Starfield. I think it'll work the same way. I wouldn't be surprised if there's also an actual ship for you to customize, because if you remember, of course, in the announcement trailer, they showed the coastline, and I think they could, of course, pivot off of it and go somewhere else, but or just not give you access to the coastline. But I wouldn't be shocked at all if it's like, hey, yeah, you get access to a ship and then you can use it to fast travel along the coast. Otherwise, maybe they swing the total opposite way. It could genuinely be really interesting if they swing completely opposite after Starfield and they're like, yeah, no more fast travel in the traditional sense. I would like to see them do the KCD2 thing, where if you want to fast travel, it's basically done in real time, where the player character is actually traveling through the world. There's opportunities for bandits to jump you, for individual encounters and things that could start side quests. It actually cycles the day-night cycle, and it would technically cover up the load screen, but I think that could be a really cool way to do it. And that could be an interesting way that they pivot off of the narrative over load screens. If they're like, yeah, no load screens except if you're fast traveling from your ship. And even then, they could do the thing where the camera pulls out to a sky view. It kind of transitions to a map, and then it shows the icon of the ship sailing up the coast as it loads, and then it fades out and you're back down into it. All sorts of stuff they could do, but that would be a good way to pivot from the narrative. I also think it's no coincidence that this is in frame precisely where you see it. As the camera pans forward. I think that this is the castle that you're going to customize. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's like the one clear structure except for the city in the distance. I think it's no coincidence that this is the one structure you can clearly make out in this trailer. I think that this is the castle you're going to get access to, and then all of the base building, fort building stuff that they built with Fallout 76, Fallout 4, and even Starfield. I think all of that is going to take place here. It's not going to look exactly the same, but I think that that's what they're trying to signal. Because Todd mentioned that they had the design doc, the one page for Elder Scrolls 6 years and years ago. And he said with each and every Elder Scrolls game, they want to take something and have like, what's the thing about that game? What's the big thing? With like Oblivion, it was fidelity. They wanted the forests to look photorealistic, and they wanted it to be like the most beautiful open world game anybody had ever seen. And with Skyrim, they wanted it to be all about the dragons. That was the focus. What's the focus for Elder Scrolls 6? Castles. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. But let's hear, continuing on with the video, what Zark thinks is most likely.
Location, while focusing on some sort of standout element that is going to attempt to what Microsoft is going to do next. So again, I think that they are going to discard a number of ideas from Starfield and focus on making the game as close to Skyrim as possible, set in a new location, while focusing on some sort of standout element that is going to attempt to elevate it past Skyrim. Be that element graphics, sounds, combat, some sort of standout game mechanic. I have no idea.
Castle.
But my theory is that because Skyrim was the most successful single-player Elder Scrolls game of all time, they will focus hard on creating a new Skyrim. When people use the term Skyrim 2, regardless of how that may bug some people, I don't think it's too far off from reality. Skyrim 2, in a new province, I would likely enjoy it greatly, but I admit a good chunk of my enjoyment in Skyrim does come from modding, and it's unlikely I will ever play Skyrim without Legacy of the Dragonborn again. But that's coming from thousands of hours of gameplay. I suspect that unless they make some kind of major misstep, Elder Scrolls 6 will probably be thoroughly enjoyable for the asking price for at least a couple hundred hours. We'll have to revisit that last point, asking price, when the game is actually up for sale at storefronts, because wild things are happening in the industry when it comes to price. That said, despite me telling you I will enjoy Elder Scrolls 6 most likely, I can tell you that modded Elder Scrolls 2, Daggerfall, is my favorite game in the series. If I had to pick strictly from vanilla, Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind is the one I would say is my favorite. But I think we're well past expecting Bethesda to create something that does much more than reference the classics. Daggerfall's design is incompatible with what people value from modern Bethesda games, and Morrowind was created by a supergroup of designers who were, for the most part, good or at least decent writers first, and then game designers second. We will probably never see that team, that kind of team, again. So 2 roads lay before us. The less likely one, where Bethesda is allowed to be as ambitious as they were with Starfield, and doing so potentially gamble the future of the Elder Scrolls franchise on an experimental game in an attempt to Hail Mary another cultural touchstone like Skyrim, or the far more likely road that leads us to Skyrim 2 in a new region. But hey, these are just guesses. As I mentioned, I have no reliable way of knowing what Microsoft is going to do. I've heard from former Microsoft employees, internally speaking, that Microsoft's upper leadership is cultish and weird. And that would track with why I can't seem to get a beat on what they're going to do next. So I'm looking forward to seeing how Elder Scrolls 6 pans out. But if you want my incredibly stupid off-the-wall prediction...
Okay, wait, I'm ready. What's it gonna be? I'm so ready. I'm excited. Zerich, good to see you. Good to see you in chat live with us. Skyrim's original plot was going to be about Uriel Septim and the fifth coming back, I can't read. The fifth coming back from the active year with an army of dragons to retake Tamriel for his dynasty. That was scrapped, but dragons remained. Yeah. Cause that sounds cool. Dragons like flying around and like you can fight them. Like that's cool too. Not quite as cool as that, but you know. That's kind of the pattern with a lot of this, is that it starts off, wow, and then, oh, okay. Like, that's where you end up almost every single time.
The Red Guards of Hammerfell are currently in a civil war between 2 factions, the Crowns and the Forebearers. The Crowns want Hammerfell independent, and the Forebearers wish to return to the Empire. But then, suddenly, during this civil war, a great cataclysm occurs. Some ancient evil arises. Is it the sinistral elves from Redguard myth? Is it the Malmer? Is it Rada al-Saran rising from the dead? Is it a brand new enemy? I have no idea. But there's one they fear.
It's dragons. It's just dragons again.
Ordained by the Redguard god of the Force to make way for their people, known as the Hunding. This hero is the Sword Singer of Legend. Hold your power button to execute a 3-note sword song attack. That was just me being silly. Those are my silly off-the-wall predictions that I don't think are going to happen. Just thought I'd throw that out there for some people. Get excited. My only real hope is that they move Emil Pagliarulo away from writing the main quest and bring in some fresh blood. Emil is a good level designer. The character writers they brought in for Starfield's companion loyalty missions seem to be better than him, and I'd like to see what they could do with the main plot. With that out of the way, I think it's time to...
I agree. It just needs fresh blood. Like, it just does. And I think that there's just, like, let's even just remove it from any sort of emotional discussion or any sort of clips or keynote speeches that have been made. Like, if we just break it down, there is a consensus among Elder Scrolls fans, among Fallout fans, Starfield fan, that the writing is lacking. It just is. Like, everybody kind of agrees on this, whether you really loved Fallout 4 or even if you loved Fallout 76 or whatever. The common thread is that the writing is lacking. And so at some point, I think you just have to go based off of the results and say, okay, well, if everybody agrees on this, Let's deal with that. It's why, to their credit, after Dragon Age the Veilguard launched, they cleaned house. Like, literally not a single one of the writers that worked on that game is still at BioWare. Now, to be fair, it sounds like basically nobody's going to be at BioWare probably fairly soon, because it sounds like they're going to close it. We'll see if they do or not under new ownership. That won't happen, though, until later next year. When the deal closes, if it does, but it probably does. But I think pretty clearly, like, the writing is a point people have found lacking, and literally the correlation is not causation, certainly, but I think it's fair to bring up just the reality that as Emil's standing within the studio has risen and he's gotten promoted, the quality has continued to drop, specifically with the writing, which is what he is in charge of. Correlation is not causation. Could be unrelated, but definitely is. I think it warrants looking into. You know, like, I think it's worth investigating a little bit. Emil, Destroyer of Worlds. That makes him sound pretty cool, honestly. And I do want to say this, like, Emil is very talented with many, many things. He's the guy that Todd was like, hey, can you come up with some sort of chant using one of the in-game languages or something? And like, we just want it to be like the lyrics that are sung when they're doing the chant. And he went off, worked on it, and came back with the chant that he had just like written. Let me see. Yep, this is it. This is literally
I
it.
found recordings of Beowulf in Old English. That gave me sort of the overall feel.
As the story goes, he kind of sat on it for a while and went home one weekend and heated up some mead and wrote the thing. He came in on Monday, there it is, and it was like, oh my gosh, this actually works.
That's cool.
Each shout has 3 components. There are 3 words. And so it becomes like, okay, I say one word, you know, foos, and then ro, and da. And so when you're doing this as a gameplay device, it's like, it has to all meld together, like, foos, ro, da.
When you say, foos, ro, da, like that, that's when the big clap.
What happens if you say it really with like bad pronunciation? Is it like diagonally? Does it do the opposite? There's probably a lore answer to that. But he is very talented. Like, that is cool. That is genuinely not something most people could do, is come up with this, like, at this point, iconic thing that he just built from scratch, basically. That is genuinely really, really cool. But that does not mean that therefore he's good at everything, you know? And I think part of one of the important things to be able to do as a leader and as a designer, really anybody in any creative pursuit, is to understand what you're good at and what you're not good at, you know? And there's times where you need to step up and or step back, I guess, and realize that you're not good at that, and that's okay. But you're gonna let other people who are good at that step in and do it. If I were Emil and I was in charge of all of this, I would go out and I'd seek out people that are really, really good at what they do. You know, I'd seek out some really talented people and maybe put them in positions in charge of writing and supervising, at the very least, some of that. Interestingly, they did hire somebody that worked at BioWare. So John Dumbro has joined BGS as a senior quest designer. If you notice, he worked on Dragon Age the Veilguard until August of 2023. He was senior writer and narrative designer on Veilguard. Then he worked on Ghost of Yote for 2 years, finished in July of this year. So probably right as they finished up anything he would have to work on. And then he moved over to work at BGS starting in August. So he's been there for just a few months. Interestingly, though, and to be very fair, there are lots of memes with Dragon Age Veilguard. Okay, we've all heard them. We all know them. There's the jokes write themselves. But if you actually look at his track record, it actually is, I think, encouraging. You see, he was the senior writer and narrative designer on Dragon Age Veilguard. Okay. He wrote the Davrin story arc, including all missions and related character relationship and romance scenes, including Asan, which was one of the few good things in the story. That's not saying a whole lot because the writing was kind of ass, but okay, that's actually, so he wrote one of the good things. He wrote the Siege of Weishaupt mission, which was genuinely like one of the coolest missions in the entire game. It was one of the like 3 things they showed us at the preview event that actually got us excited. So he wrote like probably the coolest mission in the game. Okay. The initial writing on the Veil Jumper storyline and quests before, you know, they kind of went to multiplayer and then went back to single player. And then also designed the Lighthouse and Player Hub narrative planning and design, which also was kind of cool. It had the lanterns to indicate when they had another story beat to explore and expand on. And prior to that, he did some narrative design on Anthem, co-lead writer on Mass Effect Andromeda. He supervised a team of 7 writers for the overall story, coordinated cinematics, level design, gameplay, VO, performance capture, audio. That was just kind of a bit of a mess though. And prior to that, he worked as a writer at Telltale. We can poke holes in all of this, be like, oh, well, those episodes that he worked on Telltale those were bad. Or the work he did on Dragon Age can be debated. Maybe you liked the Weishaupt mission, maybe you didn't. Maybe you liked the Davarin story arc, maybe you didn't. But I'd say that his work I find at least interesting, whether I like it or not. There's parts of it I like, parts of it I don't, but it's at least interesting. Whereas most of Emil's writing is just so flaccid. You know, there's not much there. You know, it's just a wet, limp fish on the table. You know, I want something there. I want something. And I feel like with ML, it's always very safe. It's very bland. It's very plain. There's just not a lot to work with. So at least there's something there. And I think it's interesting because historically, like BGS has not done a lot of hiring of big names from other well-known studios. They tend to hire people in lower positions and promote them from within and kind of train them up in the ways of Bethesda. And that's historically how they've done it. Their average tenure is something insane like 10 years, which is wild in this day and age to have an average tenure that high. But that's how they typically do things. But with this, they actually hired a guy to come in, and he literally just worked on one of PlayStation's biggest IP, and they're bringing him in to work as a senior quest designer. It's very interesting. Very, very interesting. And after playing Ghost of Yotei, I will say, I find it very interesting that they're bringing him in for Elder Scrolls. Because if you've played Ghost of Yotei and you think, okay, the guy responsible for the writing and like the quest design and stuff in Ghost of Yotei, he's going to be in charge for Elder Scrolls 6. I think it will be a very different vibe. I think they're going for something much more gritty. If we're going off of Ghost of Yotei compared to like Dragon Age. But we'll see. Either way, it's going to be very, very interesting. Very interesting. Let's close this out. Take it away, Zaric.
I didn't like my Fixing Starfield Part 2, so I threw it out twice. And I made this video instead because I realized that, in fact, I threw out a whole video twice. I've got a fair number more things to talk about, but we'll see how the rest of this year treats us. Question to everyone. Assuming Elder Scrolls 6
I just love the casual grabbing of a shark, and just don't mention it, just grab the shark.
does take place in Hammerfell, what would you want the main plot to be? An overwhelming number of people that I have asked have basically said Redguards versus Thalmor, which isn't a bad premise. I just don't like the Thalmor as they currently stand. I feel that they could be developed a lot more than they are now. Still, what is your ideal Elder Scrolls 6 plotline? What would you want your character to do running around Tamriel? I'll be looking at your answers in a video or two down the line. Either way.
I think what I would have them do, I think you can start really simple, honestly. You don't need to do anything too expansive. I think you just need to, I think they just need to build it out in a way where there's a little bit more dynamism. I know it's a trope of like the early 2010s where it's just like the player is basically God, you know, can do anything and everything. But I would rather explore an archetype for the player character where they start without any sort of special magical powers. Like one of the things I love about New Vegas, for example, is that you literally are starting in a grave in the ground, and you go and you're like starting from about as scratch as you possibly could be. And then it builds on it, and you have to completely rebuild not just your capabilities, but all of your possessions and everything else. You're standing within the community. You have no connections with other people. People you'll speak to will notice you're the courier and be like, oh, thought you're back. Okay. You know, they'll make comments like that. But I think with Elder Scrolls, they tend to like to have a special hook, a special element. But I'd rather if they just literally put you in this interesting world and we're like, figure it out. Figure it out. Find your place in this world. It's not been predestined for you. But I know some people will disagree with that and rather have super special powers only specifically given to the player character. But other than that, I'm very open. It's just, again, I think a lot of it's going to start from tone. They have a lot more lore to work with in Elder Scrolls compared, of course, to starting from scratch with Starfield. So that's going to be really, really interesting. But there's a lot of things that they could do. I'm just so curious. I don't need a world savior story. Yeah, well, it's kind of like sometimes Elder Scrolls stuff can kind of turn into your stereotypical D&D campaign where it's like, bad guy wants to destroy the world, you must stop him, and that's about the extent of it. And there's not a lot more depth beyond that. But maybe I'm naive for this, but I'm a firm believer that you can make almost any story compelling, no matter how simplistic it is, because it's more about the technique of the story and how it's presented to people. And you can add in context to make it more complicated. You can start with a really simple narrative that's very, very straightforward, like bad guy wants to destroy the world, you stop him. And you can make it interesting by adding nuance, by adding extra wrinkles that weren't there before, different motivations, this backstory, this over here, this faction that's competing in this way, this faction that wants to destroy it for a different reason. Like there's all sorts of things you can do, even if you start with a very, very simplistic premise. But that's where like the talent of the writers comes in, because it's not just the premise, it's about the execution of the premise and all of the extra set dressing and things that make it. You know, if you, a cooking analogy, it's like you can make an amazing dish with chicken. You can also make an incredibly boring meal with chicken. You know, it's about the seasoning. It's about the zest. It's about everything else. Everything else. That's how you do it. Power fantasy is good, but power fantasy can be done poorly, like with Skyrim. I agree. And I think it's also the temptation is, and it kind of follows in line with what Emil expressed in that talk, which is that players just want to be a super powerful murder goblin and they want to just march around killing everybody. So don't put too much effort into the NPCs because we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And it can water it down a ton. Power fantasies, it certainly can be very interesting. I mean, you could even say that like The Witcher 3 with Geralt's powers is sort of a power fantasy because there's a huge power disparity between Geralt and your average bandit, for example. But they add complexity to that where he's fighting like monsters that have a power disparity between Geralt and him, you know? So like, it's again, not just the initial point, it's like the complexity of it, how you build upon it. It's hard to mess up chicken. Oh, Shadow Zero. Oh, you poor soul. I had a chicken salad that was made with like a vegan, no calorie, no carb mayo. And like, I don't even know. It was other stuff. It was like a vegan dish. And I remember they said also like, so vegan mayo, they said vegan pickles, which I thought pickles were vegan. Like what part of animal byproducts are in pickles? I don't like what? Okay. It's like, dude, there's one time we were over at, I love Nikki's family. They're all wonderful. But dude, we were one time over and having dinner with one of her relatives. And her relative came out with organic, non-GMO, vegan salt. I was like, they just put all the buzzwords on that package, didn't they? What do you mean vegan salt? Like, what? It was the most insane thing. I was like cracking up while we're sitting at the table looking at this thing, and I just could not believe it. But I was like, I think there's actually people out there who are like, ooh, vegan. I think vegan's healthy, so I'm gonna buy this. And I'm sure it was probably like $15 for this tiny little thing, but because it's vegan salt, that means it's better. You know, it was so insane to me. All of it's technically true. Yeah, there's nothing false about that packaging. It all is accurate. It's just insane because you know it's the exact same salt as the package next to it. Nothing's different. But anyway, phenomenal video, Zark. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And again, get over there, subscribe. We got to get him to 100K. We got to do that. We got to do that. Phenomenal video. And like I said at the top, people who are like, there's often a lot of cope that can go on with this stuff, where it's like you guys are critiquing Bethesda or you are not super stoked on Starfield, therefore like you're a fake fan, or if you didn't love Fallout 4, you're a fake fan, or you didn't like Skyrim, you're a fake fan. And I think it's not helpful to dismiss critique and criticism, because ultimately, if all you want is your like echo chamber, safe space bubble, then all you're ever going to make is exactly what you made before. And you're never going to actually like change or evolve and shift and make improvements. And that's been my concern from the very, very start with all of it, is that I feel as though there is no real appreciation of the fans' critiques beyond the stuff that they want to agree with from the outset. And so I'm just hoping that they can appreciate it, learn from it, and actually make changes. Because like I said, I think there is a way in which they could take the feedback from Starfield and actually have actionable improvements for Elder Scrolls 6. Imagine if they came out with Elder Scrolls 6 and they're like, so with Starfield, we heard you, no load screens during exploration at all. And it's sort of a loophole, and it's like, well, it's because fast travel now takes place in real time, so the map goes out to an overhead view, and then it kind of plays out very, very quickly in a sped up way like KCD2, so it's kind of covering up a load screen. Maybe whenever you go into a dungeon, they do sort of a Batman Arkham Asylum thing where the camera angles up, and then you walk through the door, and then it kind of transitions into the dungeon or whatever they would do. I understand the creation engine can't do fully seamless open world exploration, but there's ways that they could sort of get away on a technicality. But if they were to actually respond to the criticism and critiques, I think there would be a huge shift in the narrative. But so far I've seen no indication that they think anything is wrong at all. And it's too bad, because I think it means we're probably going to get the exact same thing, but next time. And that's just too bad. Yes, I did just put the link into both chats. So get over there, get subscribed, show them some love. Great video. And again, it's nice to see somebody who really, really knows what they're talking about break this down. So phenomenal video. Yeah, The Elder Scrolls 6 is a home run, is kind of the home run if Bethesda F's this up. Oh man. I mean, I hope they don't. I think we're all braced for it. Either way, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be captivating, dare I say. He took my thing.